No worries.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody, to the Clear Swear Ring Mail podcast and vidcast this week because I've got a special guest for you today, and special in the real sense of the word, not special in the sense of happens to know Taylor on Discord. All right. Today I've got a creator, a Kickstarter, and an all around interesting individual. Go ahead, sir. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh man, I don't know if I can live up to all of that, but hey guys, my name is Josiah Mork. I'm a college student at Liberty University and an avid gamer, founder of Hoodwink Games, and publisher of the basic and generic BAG tabletop role-playing system. Yeah, just excited to chat and get to know you guys a little bit.
All right, thank you very much, Josiah, for coming on the show. You are the first person I've had on whose name is even more biblical than the ones that my wife gave our children. So you got that going for you. Yeah, let's see, you are, as I understand it, and the reason I brought you on, you are working on a new expansion for your basic and generic product.
Mhm.
Hey, well, I know that's the reason I found out about you. I ran into that particular Kickstarter, and that's I figure why some of my listeners might be interested. So we'll start right on in. Tell us a little bit about your. Let's see, what is I forgot to write down the name of it. Tell me a little bit more about your is Ancient Empires,
Early empires,
Early
yeah.
Empires, which is close.
Yeah, I know you were doing good. Yeah, so it's a role-playing expansion that takes place around 1500 BC in the area of Canaan. So it digs into kind of what those ancient empires looked like, whether it was in the south with like the rise of the Egyptian Empire. In the north, you have the Hittite Empire. In the east, you have just the early buds of the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian empires, which were the Amorites. You have the Israelites moving up and migrating into the region, getting in conflict with the Amalekites, the Philistines, the Jebusites. All of those little sites and ites names that were scattered throughout the Bible that no one really knows what they are. So what the manual does is it digs into each of those empires and really looks at kind of what makes them special, learning about their cities. The manual includes over 30 maps of historically accurate versions of the cities based on different archaeological data. It digs into all of the major deities of the region. So you have some of the Sumerian deities like Baal and Asherah. You have some of the Amorite deities like Shamash. You have the classic Egyptian deities, Ra and Sobek and things like that. And then, of course, Yahweh is the Israelite deity. And so it tries to give a really historical account of all of the lore that was happening at this point, with a bunch of NPCs and kind of plot hooks that you can dig into, and tells it in the context of like this cosmic war that was going on between Yahweh and all of these other deities at the time. So it just kind of gives you the information that you need to run this setting a little bit better because there's not a whole lot of content out there for this period.
Yep, I agree with that, and that's one of the reasons I was very excited for this particular Kickstarter. It sounds like you had done a lot of research into the topic, and I myself have gone on record for advocating that Old Testament biblical time frame, and you're looking closer to the Judges period, if I remember correctly, uh,
Yep.
and let's see, and here we are. Profile about. I should. You think I would have prepared for this by opening this so I could speak to it intelligently, but no, I didn't. I just have my. I have my little notepad list of bag-related puns that I can throw at you. So now that I've let that out of the bag, the
Appreciate there.
this particular early empires, it's already funded, so we know you're going to move into it. I am
Mhm.
in for so we're pledged tiers. We got between $1 and 35, so not too much risk in there. I'm somehow in between two of the tiers. I guess I'm paying in Florida dollars. They're funny money down here, but that's okay.
Oof.
So I've gone off on a bit of a tirade there. One of the interesting things that I noticed about the tier pledges is you named them after different, uh, uh, I guess, national, not ethnic, but groups. Different. You named the different
Yeah.
tiers out of the different groups, and that was particularly attractive because that kind of implies that you've gone into a lot of research about the setting, not the setting, but about the uh, about the region and during that time period. So is that just a passion of yours? Is that a something that you dive into in your spare time, or something that you've walked into as part of academia?
I guess it was just kind of dabbling in a lot of different directions before I came to this game. I am a Christian, and I try to dive into God's word pretty frequently. And I was reading through this period of Judges, and there's just a lot of those names that get thrown out of like the different people groups. And it's just a lot of information, but I'm always curious about it. And one of my favorite topics that I dug into a long time ago when I was littler was the Nephilim and the Rephaim, which are, for anyone who doesn't know, they're gigantic, like mythical sized warriors of this era here. And they're believed, at least biblically, to have been like the children of demons and humanity from well before the even the biblical flood, and then they're just kind of the descendants that became these evil heroes of the region there. And that was just such a tabletop role playing game concept, right? Like men with the blood of demons that are giants. And so I kind of dug into that just reflectively as I was reading through the passage, and there was an article on a academic journal that was looking into the idea behind giants because it's something very common throughout all lore. And they're saying that biblically, the only hereditary family of giants that's mapped out are Goliath and his family that were all from the Philistine city of Gath. And I just thought that was so cool that like there was a scientific academic journal on hereditary health conditions
Mm.
mapping out this supernatural thing. And so, with that in mind, I just started to dig into every other aspect of the region. What are the, archaeological evidence of these different cities? Looking at like Jericho. The first excavations of Jericho found exactly the account that we see in the Bible, where all of the walls somehow fell outward except for one particular patch of the wall, which we know biblically was from Rahab's house, where because she helped the Israelites, then her family and living in that part of the wall was saved. And so it was just something that I was like, it's too epic to not put into a game, but it's also too factual and historical to mess up. And so I just felt like if I was going to do it justice, I had to dig into all of the different people groups, like you mentioned, in the different kingdoms and all the fun little facts that really make it so real.
Yep, very cool. And there's actually, and I will put this first and foremost. I'm going to link to you and to your various media platforms in the show notes. But it's funny talking about the Nephilim, and there was. Do you listen to? There's a podcast. I think the fellow's name is Ricky Pope. Christian Nerds Unite. I think
Oh, I
he.
haven't. No, I haven't
Yeah,
heard it.
I will link it in the show notes because not 2 weeks ago, he did a two-part interview with a religious fiction. So, yeah, I think that's the right way to put it. It's Christian fiction, where the guy wrote a novel series about the Nephilim, and they talk in depth about the same subject. So that might be worth, if you find yourself on the toilet for 2 hours, that might be worth your worth a listen. So I'll link that just for interest. Um, in
Absolutely.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
no problem. And again, let's see. Let's see. That's fun. So you you came into this idea from the biblical perspective, from the religious perspective.
Mhm.
How did you? And this is maybe more personal. How did you come into gaming in general? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so actually Foxtrot Comics, funny enough, I don't know if anybody's read them before, but highly recommend. Two of the characters, Jason and Marcus, play Dungeons and Dragons throughout it, and the writer just plays on some of the classic tropes of gamers. And as, like a little 8-year-old somebody, this game that they were playing sounded super cool, where you got to make up characters and explore dungeons. Um, and so I asked my parents if I could play it, and they said no, because of the big scare that they're in like the 80s and
Mm.
everything, and how Dungeons and Dragons was evil and whatnot. Um, And so for a long time, I wasn't allowed to play, but I had this idea of what the game might be like. And so I went through so many iterations of trying to make games based on just these comic strips of like how it looked like it was played. And then eventually in Boy Scouts, I met friends who did play Dungeons and Dragons. And I got to kind of look over some of the source material and watch them play it and stuff. And at that point, I'd already kind of come at it from a certain direction. And then this was probably around when I was like 15-ish.
So last
I
year.
not quite. I I got to um like try and play, and I really didn't enjoy it that much because it was so complicated. Like there were, two or three 250-page manuals worth of information. I was like, this concept is so cool. And obviously this execution works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for me. And for most of the other high school guys I knew who were impatient, and there are a lot of other things you can do, it was killer to try and find a group. So I was like, okay, maybe I can do better than this. And that's really where BAG came from. It was just this module system of, starting super simple, adding rules, make it more complicated as people get more engaged. And I definitely would not go so far as to say it's better than D&D. I think better D&D, as I've grown to understand it, really is the hallmark of role playing, but it fills a very different niche. And so that's kind of how I got into it, was just not being able to play that, and so kind of finding my own way, and then eventually filling my own gap of making something that it'll introduce people to types of things like D&D.
Well, that's fun. You mentioned, and I did read a little bit about the Bag RPG, and it's described as modular, and I think you alluded to that in what you were saying. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So when I was looking at the D&D manual, the first thing that hit me is like, man, this is like a math textbook. Like there's so many numbers. And then when I was taking math, I was like, why isn't it taught like a math textbook where you learn the very basic principles until you can do that? And then in the next module, you add more complicated things that let you do more. And so when I was writing BAG, that was really the mentality I had, is like, wait, we can start small. Basically, all you need to do is know what numbers to look for on your character sheet and what dice to roll. And then once you know that, then you can add in, magic rules, warfare rules, crafting rules, all that other stuff. And so it is broken into three, like 10 to 20 page sections that kind of simplifies everything into a gradual slope. So you can start after playing or after reading like the first 5 pages. And then once you're good with that, you can play everything or, part of it. And it's great too because then, if you're a super experienced player who's played, everything from D&D to Shadowrun or something, then you can play with all of the modules. And if I've never played anything before, I can play with the first 10 pages. And we're playing the same game, but you're just more engaged because it's more complicated, and I'm more engaged because I can understand it.
Oh, nice. That is fun. So I did. It's fun. You mentioned the march up kind of idea, the dive in of the big manual, because my audience tends to be more of the old school crowd. I tend to flavor myself as one of the old school Renaissance men, so to speak. And it's a movement that kind of strives for the simplicity of the early years of the D&D game. So it's funny enough you mentioned that because that's speaking to exactly some the majority of my audience. One, folks who are interested in systems and games that are outside of the mainstream D&D, but and you can steal mechanics and pop modules out of, but also the original introductory set for the Dungeons and Dragons game that came out before either of us were born. The basic set, it started with that was a 40-page folio, and then they released the expert set, which was another 40 pages, and then by the mid 80s they had extended that out, but that was originally a way to get into the game that was a lot lighter than the advanced version, which is what got all of the we'll call it bad press right around the steam tunnels that inspired a
Yeah.
Dexter's Lab cartoon episode. But the and then but at the same time too, the advanced game from the before the current edition, so to speak, was still a lot. it looks more intimidating than it is. So there's a simplicity to it, a flow to it that I think gets lost in translation in some of the newer editions. But so it's very fun. You mentioned that, so that'll hopefully speak Scout's honor to those honors to that audience. So that's funny.
Great.
You're an Eagle Scout, as I remember.
Yep, that's
Yep.
correct.
And so that's how you know you can trust this fella to push through on the Kickstarter. Because if he doesn't, the Boy Scouts will come back and steal his eagle. That's not true. You're one of two Eagle Scouts that I've met. One of them was my roommate in college. He had to go back and do it when he was 17 because I think he quit when he was in when he went to high school, but he was like 15 minutes away from finishing, and he's like, and they won't let you come back in and do it if you're 18, so he had to come back the summer of 17 and finish it out. So you're one of two people that I know who've achieved that particular milestone. So that's a big deal, and congratulations on that. So,
Thank you.
but and more so, I understand this is not your first trip around the block in terms of Kickstarters. Just checking around, I saw that you had kickstarted the original bag product, and that seems to have gone pretty well. You want to speak to your experience in that regard?
Yeah, that was a great experience. So that was what, December of 2020, I think, because I kind of finalized bag during COVID season.
Hmm.
Nothing else to do. So and that was a great experience. Yeah, we had great response internationally, honestly. I think there were over 10 different countries that we had people backing from on pretty much every continent. And but it was also a little bit humbling because there's a lot of with every platform, tools that I didn't understand at the time. And just the idea of like engaging, building publicity. For that, I bought my first Instagram ads. They tanked terribly. Those little things that you kind of trial and error through. And so I was blessed with a great community of people that were interested. We still have some guys that reached out actually for this Kickstarter. We had about a dozen people come back with their responses from the first one, and they were just so generous about the process and everything. Thankfully, order fulfillment went well. We got everything out on time, but it was just a matter of learning, drive-through RPGs, complementary copies tool, learning, what printer is the best, what print on demand things you need to do, what bleed marks do you need to learn and everything. So thankfully I was able to kind of hammer out a process for myself that I'll be able to use for this expansion, and I've got about three or four more in the pipeline that we're working on. So hopefully for those two and keep refining it. But it was a great experience. Just learned a lot that I was able to reapply.
Yep, that's actually pretty cool to hear. I did check the comments on that one, like the messages that had gone out. And while I think some of the shipping did run a little past the projected end date, the fact that it only ran past by like a month is extremely impressive, considering the supply chain restrictions that came up right around or right after that time. So that's a hats off kind of moment. That was very impressive. Are you using the drive through again this time around?
Yeah, we'll be using drive-through for the digital copies, the PDF copies. They just have a great setup over there. So I love using that. And then for the paperback, I've actually been using Lulu, which is a print on demand and self-publishing resource. We use Ingram for the actual distribution to make it wholesale available for stores and stuff.
Hmm.
But for the order or the reward fulfillment, Lulu is great because it lets you actually print in the home country and then deliver it, which cuts down costs for everybody. So that kind of helps reach out to the international audience a little more.
Okay, cool. And that's Ingram Publishing, or uh, in ounce for you imperial types out there. Um, that's not true. I made that up. But see, cool. See, I'm an absolutely terrible interviewer in this regard. But so, are you? I understand you do. Are you a solo shop, or do you got some friends working on this with you?
So at the moment, I'm solo, although I can't really say that. My friends are my playtesters, my critiques, my editors, my I mean, they're everything at this point. But I do all of the art, the writing, the promotion, the page layouts, everything in that regard. At least for this project, I do have two contracts with people at school, an artist and a writer, for our next project that's actually not bag related,
Hmm.
but it'll so eventually we'll be a little bit more than just a one man show. But at the moment, yeah, I wear all the hats.
Yeah, got growth on the mind. That's exciting. So this, I think you mentioned you have an artist lined up for an upcoming project. For this project, I want to say I saw that you did your own illustration.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's fun. So that's something that you're interested in. That's something that's uh, pr- uh, what's the word I'm looking for? That's something professional about you.
Yeah, my one of my minors is graphic design, and kind of my focus within that is illustration. So art is my passion. I love branding. I love like logos, social media branding, anything like that. But I really like creating characters. And the deities for this project particularly, I mean, I'm sure there are far better artists out there than I am, but for where I'm at right now, I was very, very happy to be able to work on them and how they came out. And you can see some of them on the Kickstarter page, but that's the type of thing that I'd like to keep doing as the manuals go along.
Yep, a lot of interesting art on the Kickstarter page, and kind of shows you the. Presumably, that's the kind of thing that's going into the finished product.
Yo,
Oh,
those are Snapchats, or not Snapchats, snapshots, from more or less the final copies. There are a few tweaks that we need to make, but the art and everything is final.
yeah, you got to be a very good reader for the Snapchat copy because as soon as you pipe it off, it's gone. You have to buy it again. It's a good business model
Sounds
though. It's even better than an NFT. But,
like
so fun. All right. So from here, we know that this is funded. And we know it's going to happen. And we've actually unlocked one of these. Your first stretch goal. Do you? Let's see. You want to speak to your stretch goal, the geography bit, a little bit?
Absolutely. So I did a real quick Google survey to kind of gauge what people's interests were and what they would want for the stretch goals. And one of the biggest things was just more cities and more information about what there was in this world. And some people mentioned too that they were really more interested in like Samaria than they were in Egypt because Egypt is kind of hyped up and you kind of see that a lot. And so to kind of scratch that itch, this stretch goal will dig into Nippur, Uruk, and Haran, which is a major Hittite city. And I was able to kind of just do some cursory research before creating the stretch goal. And there's actually really good accounts of what these cities looked like, with the exception of Haran. We have to kind of go a little bit more creative in that route. But like for Nippur, there's actually a tablet with the exact layout of the city on it. And so this expansion just kind of puts those into the manual, gives you some details about what those major landmarks are, and then gives you a couple paragraphs on what the city is kind of built around, major attributes of the city, major like cults of the city, that type of thing.
Cool. And then we let's see. I'm checking at the moment. We are about halfway towards your second stretch goal. That is the Code of Nesilim. Now, I don't know if my podcast reach is wide enough to get us there. I will be pushing this out as soon as I can, kind of pimping you a little bit because I'm interested in this secondary stretch goal and hope we can hit there. Let's see, what are the Nesilim and what is the code that we're looking to crack?
Yeah, so the Code of Hammurabi is relatively common, the law that the Hammurabi laid down for the Babylonian kingdom. But one of the backers recommended, I think Fox Ross was the guy in the comments. Um, he was saying that like it'd be really interesting to see some of the other laws. And so I looked, are there other laws? There are. The Code of Nesilim actually is a established code for the Hittites of what their expectations were, and then the Assyrians have their own. And then of course the Israelites did through the Abrahamic, or not the Abraham, the Mosaic law. And so I really hope that this one gets unlocked because I think it'll be super fun. to include some of these laws in the game. And then you'll know as a player exactly what to expect if you come into a city. So if you go into like a Hittite city and you say, kill this guy that you've been commissioned to kill, well, what does the law then say has to happen to you as a result? And can you just pay your way out? Can you like, do you have to barter with somebody? Do you have to make a sacrifice at a temple, whatever? And these four ancient laws that we have in tablets recorded, um, are very explicit about the things that have to happen. And there's some really weird ones too. Like I don't remember exactly what it was, but there was something about like if you like stole a man's cow or something and you had to be hung on the doorstep of your house and then like buried at its threshold or something weird, and like all these just really oddly specific things. And so I think it just adds so much realism and so much like tension when you go into the city to then know exactly what the legal code is, and it just adds so much reality to being a player in the system. So I really hope it comes together. We'll see. Like you said, we're still about halfway to go, but
Yep. And how much fun would it be for the players not to have read that in advance and have to go through something strange like that?
exactly. It'd be a lot of fun for the GM, that's for sure.
That's fun. So the deities section, I recall there are 13 different profiles that you've got planned. My favorite of which is Dagon, though that's going to upset the Call of Cthulhu community because they're going to find out that Dagon is not actually a fish. So let's see. Do you, yeah, if he's like a grain deity, if I remember correctly, and the father of the not Marduk, but Baal, who was then Marduk's dad, but depending on the tradition. So I've done a
Mhm.
little bit of research on this one. My personal campaign setting that I've run for the last long time, but it's based on the Phoenicians, the protogenitors of Carthage, and a seafaring version of the Canaanites, which, like you had mentioned, there's a whole lot of support for Hellenic kind of myth. So you can get your Minotaurs, you can get your Zeus and Poseidon. There's a lot of support for demotic myths. So Egypt, you have your Sobeks, your Ras, and there's not as much on the in between. And
Mhm.
that was a very interesting, and I settled on what I settled on because it's an opportunity to expand throughout the Mediterranean region and to dive into a mythos that not a lot of people know about. So
Mhm.
if you were to pick out some stuff that you found most interesting, kind of diving into these cultures, these religions that pepper the Old Testament, that the judges and the Israelites would have been surrounded by. What if you were to pick out something that you learned from all of that that's going to stick with you, either as a person or in the context of the game? What would you say your favorite piece of all of this kind of coming together was?
Oh man. I think Bale was actually my favorite to dig into, particularly in regards to the Hittites, because there was
Baal
this.
needed to be the god of hay. Just throwing that out there, Assyrians.
Well, in a way, he was. I mean, of the fields and the harvest and stuff. Although I guess a lot of gods had their hands in that pie. Um, but just the idea of like he had such a duality. Like he was the storm god, but he was also like the god of the harvest. And so it was kind of weird to see that duality. He was like the warlord and like the war protector fighting against, I think Mut is his like opposite. But he would also, like, if you read the accounts of worship for him, would have his people like slash themselves. And so they're like going to war, but almost with themselves. And it was just really interesting because he was such a permeating deity. I mean, you see him all across Canaan. Um, and into Anatolia and stuff. And there's just this weird duality about him that for some reason people really liked and like really got into. But I guess you could say that for all of the deities, because like I mean, some of them, Moloch, you're burning your children, and people still did it. But like it was weird to see because he was almost just a different form of Yahweh, whereas he was on the war path, Like he was leading his people on the warpath, just with a completely different focus, like very introspective rather than focused on like the people's good. So I think learning about him and really the empires that followed him and stuff was my favorite.
Cool. And then being able to juxtapose how he would have, how that cult would have caught on, would have presented itself by comparison to to the Israelite religion coming in out of the 40 years, and
Exactly.
fun. Now, and you mentioned the Moloch and the Tophets with the child burning.
Hmm.
On some other podcasts, there's been some speculation well, I say on other podcasts, in the archaeological community. I remember when I first had read about that, and I thought to myself, this doesn't make sense. There's no way this can be. Why did people follow this cult? And then there's some archaeological disagreement. They said, well, we don't actually know that they sacrificed children because the Bible portrays them negatively because they're the enemy, and
Hmm.
then you're like, well, the Romans said the same thing, and the Romans and the Jews didn't get along either. So if they don't get along, and they agree though that these guys sacrifice. Well, the Romans always try to defame, and they did it themselves. Well, we actually uncovered a Tophet, a site where there are urns filled with the cremated remains of children. Well, you don't know that those were actually sacrificed. So the point is, yeah, they did. They did. This was on our law to chaos spectrum. This is far on the side of chaos. So it did happen. It's a dark point in the region, and this sort of it sets the tone for the history. And can you speak a little bit to the tone that you're going for in this? Are you going for more darker? Are you going for more kind of higher level? What was your goal when you set out for the tone of this piece?
Yeah, so I wanted to make it accurate, but ultimately accessible. And that was a really fine line to walk with things like child sacrifice and Moloch and things, because you do see, really terrible things happened in this period and were done to people in this period. If you read anything about like the cult of Ishtar too in Babylon, there's some really not child appropriate stuff that happened there. Um, and so I didn't want to necessarily shy away from that, but at the same time I want it to be a game that, people could teach their kids with, because it is an intro level tabletop role playing game. And so ultimately the line that I ended up walking on is labeling these things as evil. I mean, Moloch is historically, biblically, morally, whatever metric you want to use, just evil. It's bad. And so it didn't shy away from that, but also tried to put it into a context of like the people in that area. So, from what little historical record we have, there isn't a lot about him. It was mostly the Amalekites that worshipped him, and even the Amalekites there really isn't very much about. And so it was kind of stringing these different facts together with a 40,000 foot view of what might have been the actual thing that was happening there. So, for Moloch specifically, I'll give a little bit of a spoiler, I guess you could call it. But the Amalekites were originally the first of the nations we read in I think it was Genesis, somewhere in the Old Testament, early Old Testament. And then the next time we see them, they're these demon worshiping baby sacrificers. And so instead of digging into like, oh wow, these are the horrible things that they're doing right now, vividly portraying it, it's a brief description of they started great. There's a famine that happened. We can see archaeologically there's a famine. We know from Joseph's story there was a famine in the region. We know that the Amalekites lived in the Negev. Maybe out of just desperation, they start turning to darker powers or using more extreme methods to try and have control. And so then that kind of introduces the Moloch mythos with the expectation that there was desperation, there was evil, all of the things you would see with a normal RPG cult. Um, and that's really kind of the mentality that cues up a lot of these issues, where it gives the context, it gives the implication that there's a lot of bad things, and it labels it as bad without necessarily digging into the nitty-gritty details of exactly what was going on.
Okay, so you have the jet's eye view and allows you to set the tone yourself.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep, perfect, perfect. So, yeah, let's see. Now, this is not the first supplement you'd worked on for the bag system. I want to say I also saw there was a suburb related one. Speaking of Moloch,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
That Suburbville, yeah, it was our first one. We actually got that as a result of stretch goal from my first Kickstarter or first successful Kickstarter, back in December with the base system. And that one, honestly, I loved how it turned out. So it's a city, coastal U.S. city in more or less contemporary period. Um, it's been taken over by zombies, and it's not like, you're fighting off the horde. It's happened. Like zombies are there, cities in ruins. And so the manual comes with, it gives you detailed map of the city, all of the major landmarks, and then it gives you the different factions within the city. And I try to not really not take it too seriously. This is more of Fallout with cartoons, I guess, style than what you might get in like oh, I don't know, trying to think of another World War Z, we'll say.
Mhm.
So it's kind of theatrical and just kind of fun and cartoony, and the art style is kind of reflective of that. So you have all the factions, and you have different NPCs and different abilities with all of them. I kind of got to draw on some of my own experiences. There's
With
a
zombies.
patrol. Well, not quite as much in that sense. But just like there's a church group there, held out in this like big cathedral, and there's a Boy Scout troop, held up in a school, and obviously zombie apocalypse has made them, a little bit different than what you might encounter now. But it just kind of was like, well, what if happened to just these normal things that we see in everyday life. So yeah, it's super fun. It's got maps of all of the locations. It's got some special hidden Easter eggs in there, a bunch of named NPCs that you can play with. There's a skyscraper in there with like 20 levels, and it's meant to be kind of like a meat grinder puzzle where you start at floor one and you have to work your way up floor by floor, and each one's filled with all kinds of booby traps and messed up stuff. So it's really just meant to be a sandbox for people to play around in.
Yep. How much of the you were talking about like maps and NPCs and kind of how much of that fed into your uh, envisioning for early empires?
A lot of it. I really had when I started on Suburbville, I really had to figure out what kind of expansions I wanted to make for Bag. D&D is blessed with such a big community that they can have lore books and item books and campaigns or whatever. But I needed to figure out what kind of expansion I was going to do. And I thought about, just doing lists of names and items or, lists of abilities or whatever, and didn't really love that. I didn't really love the campaign idea either because it's lots of detailed info and it kind of pigeonholes you into a certain story that people might not really want to tell. And Bag really is about telling your own stories. It's a system or a setting generic system. And so I decided more on the sandbox world setting where I'll give you all the locations, all the people, all the tools you need to tell your own awesome story. But at the end of the day, it'll be your story in this location. And that's really the mindset I took into early empires too.
Yeah, very cool. And I noticed too that you're introducing a new mechanic, a new modular system in this particular Kickstarter. I believe it's the Conquest or Mass, uh, the Conquest mechanic. I just found
Yeah.
the highlighted bit.
Yeah, that plays off of, so the core bag manual includes rules for running like a big battle. So if you're, with 100 divisions of this group or whatever going to fight these other guys, instead of having to play from like the first person perspective, the system allows you to kind of zoom out and see that play out. And then with this particular setting in early empires, war was such a huge deal. You see Joshua's campaign taking things over, like Tutmos the Third had huge campaigns. Uh, was Muatawa the Third, I think, was the Hittite king. All kinds of major campaigns. And so I wanted people to be able to play that out. And so the cities are designed, the maps, there's one version of the map that's just all the locations and all of the things that make up the city. And there's another one that breaks it down into battle sectors. And so if you are playing with one of those battle mechanics, it lets you further break it down into fighting for the different divisions of the city, and it kind of makes you follow the routes that would have been with like the walls and the landmarks that they had. And so you can play out that defender attacker mechanic of like the cities getting taken, which hopefully will be fun if people want to play through, some of those warfare mechanics. I had fun with it.
Yep. I would too. I was, that was the core of my question, is I was wondering if this was a mass battle type opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yep, cool. Now, I will admit I had meant to pick up the bag free edition and kind of thumb through it before we talked, but as I had mentioned to you kind of off camera, my son was ill over the weekend and I didn't really do anything apart from cleaning up after that. So, can you tell me a little bit? Because I went to the Hoodwinked Games and I found the three main products that you have right now, which, if I remember correctly, there was the bag core, the bag free edition, and then the Suburbville expansion. Can you tell me a little bit about the core edition versus the core free and what the difference between those two might be?
Yeah, for sure. So the core free is just the first module of the full thing. So if you were to read the first chapter of the core free and the first chapter of the whole thing, they'd be identical. So it gives you everything you need to play. You can build a full character, um, or a level one character. You can play through all of the necessary mechanics. Um, it's a full game in and of itself. But if you want to add the magic mechanics, the crafting mechanics, the city conquest, things like that, then or not city conquest, that's in early empires, but the battle
Good reason to
sides,
back it, obviously.
yeah, one of them at least. Then yeah, then you have to go into the full thing. So it's really there just to kind of let people try it out, or if they just want to try out role-playing games in general, and it's there for them. And yeah, lets you know exactly what to expect if you want to get the full system.
Yep, that's exciting. I may have to try that. And the modules themselves. Now, would someone be able to use this early empires document without using the bag base system, or is it more firmly rooted in the bag?
You definitely could. You could use most of the information, honestly, because that's most of what the manual is just information. And so you could use all of the lore on the cities, the people groups, the history. You could honestly even draw from the deities a lot because the concept behind the deities really applies to most magic systems for RPGs. Um, the only things that would be harder to use would be the NPCs, just because their stat blocks and abilities are built specifically around bags mechanics. But our local game store in here, shout out to Modern Explorers Guild, they market it as something that you can use with any system because you just kind of have to know what stats to fidget with, and you can take the character from bag and put it into D&D or GURPS or whatever. So it might take a little bit of work to use the NPCs and the deities, but all of the lore, all of the maps is perfect.
So yeah, so I mention it in part because that was secretly what I was excited about regarding this Kickstarter, is because although I had not heard of the bag system, I was very excited about the way this was presented. You had maps and lore and it seems like you've done all of the research and kind of compiled it together in a usable format. And so now I don't have to.
Exactly. Yep. Trying to save you some headache, which we all know GMs need.
Yeah, yeah, especially especially us older ones who don't sleep enough as is. So
Thanks.
now there are six different reward tiers, as I understand it. The lowest being a backer credit, the $1 thank you for donating, all the way up to $35, and the this is information for anybody who may be listening. Our tier two, you get the $5 is the early empires PDF. So everything that we've talked about so far you have access to at that price point. And then as you go up, you can get print copies, you can get PDF copies of this and the bag system and our zombie suburbs, I believe. Did you throw that in there?
I think the PDF is thrown in there. I
Yes, it
don't.
is. Yep, here it is, tier
Yeah.
3. So I think I'm in there somewhere. But so I'm not going to go through all 6 of them. I'm not going to steal your thunder. But for you, the listeners at home, low price of entry, and you get a whole lot of it. Especially if you are interested in the biblical period, the Old Testament role playing, and if you're interested in the Bronze Age
Mhm.
and how they saw through the world. So, are you seeing? I know the. Are you seeing the same kind of international engagement on this one that you did for the bag go live?
Yeah, I'm frankly really surprised, but yeah, some of our first backers were from Australia. That's actually our second biggest represented company or country. I think we have 5 people from Australia. We have 2 people from Israel, which kind of puts the pressure on. I hope I get the history right. Um, we've had
They'll
people
pick up the manual. I
from
can see my house from here.
well, okay, you laugh. Actually, this is a little tangential, but you'd be surprised how many of the cities I looked at that are still cities, or that cities have been built on top of them. So kind
Oh, okay.
of.
I believe
Um,
you. I'd run to the cabinet and back. My aunt went to Israel on a not a pilgrimage trip, but it was a church trip, and she came
yeah,
back with Jordan River water in a little cross-shaped vial that we have sitting on the the cabinet. So what wasn't sure what to do with it, but it's we now have Jordan River water and a couple T-shirts for the boys.
very cool.
Yeah, but I interrupted you. You had some
Oh,
Australians.
no.
You had and the Australians make sense because really it's already tomorrow there today. So they must have gotten wind of the Kickstarter early, at least 24 hours. Just that's science. That's time zones. So, but
Fair enough.
now and I
Yeah, there's been a good showing too in Eastern Europe. We've had a good number of people. I think from what Czech Republic, Hungary. There's been a couple. We're actually blessed to be working on a partnership with a Hungarian publisher right now, Rollins Publishing over there, that's hoping to translate Bag and then republish it in Hungarian. So they're working on building a community over there right now. Ireland's been a big one. One of our best supporters, honestly, most interactive supporters, has been from Ireland. So yeah, there's been a good turnout. It's just really encouraging, frankly.
and
Yeah.
you're officially treating the Eastern Europe better than our D&D overlords, Wizards of the Coast. Recently in the old school news, I guess, or the RPG news. Stop me if you've heard of this.
Yeah.
They had worked with a Hungarian company to produce a fifth edition translation, but due to hiccups in royalty negotiations with one of their other international partners, Wizards of the Coast actually kind of reneged on that promise. So there was a specifically in Hungarian, the translation was made, printed, and was ready to go, but is now languishing in a warehouse because Wizards rescinded the rights. So you heard it here
My God.
first. Hoodwinked Games loves Hungary much more than those fat cats on the coast.
Hey, we try and do everybody justice. That's all I can say. Especially because they're the only ones interested at this point. But it's been a blessing working with them, that's for sure.
Yep. So you have at least one backer in Florida, and that was me, and that's a U.S. East Coast. Then I did take a look at the map of the Hoodwinked Games website, where you had the highlighted where some of the communities are springing up, and I've decided you need some marketing in Kazakhstan. Why is that? Because Kazakhstan provides that nice little interlude between Oceania and Eastern Europe, and then once we can get a community going up there, the sun will never set on the hoodwinked empire.
I like this plan. I like this plan. We're gonna have to work on that.
Yep, yep, and we'll find a way to distribute it because I'm pretty sure there are a couple cities in Kazakhstan that actually do have internet compared to the surrounding mountain area, which has essentially sheep, if I remember correctly. But I digress. I will stop exhibiting my ignorance in international politics, and we'll double back a little bit to you. Now, you mentioned that, and this is straight up on the Hoodwinked game page. You put this in the Kickstarter right off the rip, that you are a man of faith. You are a Christian author and writer, or a Christian creator, and that this story, this supplement, is told from a Christian perspective. Can you speak to a little bit about how that influenced what is that perspective? How does it influence the writing and the presentation?
Yeah, so early empires isn't really told from any particular, person's perspective. It's not really like first person. It is more of just kind of information, but it's told from the understanding of the period, which I think is the biblical understanding of the period, and therefore I believe, just from my own research and convictions, that it is the true understanding of the period. Um, there are all of these people groups, and most of them are vying with each other, and most of them are vying with each other because of what they believe their deities are really telling them to do, or the day-to-day life that kind of stems from the following of their deities. And the clearest example of that, obviously, is the Israelites, who are explicitly told, leave Egypt, go to this land, conquer these people, and for most of these people, kill them all. And that's a big pill to swallow and kind of a big thing to look at in this game. And so, from the research that I've done, as a Christian, trying to understand God and, his character as someone who claims to follow him, um, it is important to me to get that right. And so what that ultimately came down to in the game is that the setting is there are these nations that are just living in debauchery. Like if you look at what the deities of these pagan kingdoms called for, it was a horrible life of of self-harm, of abuse, often like sexual abuse, physical abuse, child abuse. It was this kind of like desperate existence where you would be sacrificing and you would be praying and you would be, doing this stuff just to try and hope that your crops would grow and that your people wouldn't die. And a lot of people would look at God, Yahweh, and be like, well, he did the exact same thing. And what the manual tries to show is how the perspectives were really different and are really different. Where with Yahweh, the Israelites are told to make these sacrifices and to keep these rituals that look really excessive. But it's done because God is trying to show them that there's a better way than what the nations around them are doing, and that there is a holy and perfect order that comes just from God. And he is trying to draw this sharp divide of what the path he is leading them on and the path that every other deity offers. And so these conquests that they have and these strict standards that they have is not to deprive themselves and therefore, blow up the ego of God. It's more God is entering into this covenant with them to show them that there is a better way, that they can be happy, healthy, and successful in Him. And it's a way that none of the other deities are willing to show. And that plays out through this cosmic war because Yahweh is leading them on this path into Canaan. It's a land that's already in the steadfast grip of these deities that offer all kinds of sensual offerings that ultimately lead to destruction. And that's the worldview that all of the details, all of the history, all of the archaeology goes through. And it doesn't come up super often in the book, so if you're not into that, you don't have to be. But that's the meta narrative that it goes with.
And you don't necessarily have to. You can set it during the 40 years, presumably. So,
Hmm. Absolutely.
yeah. And for my audience is very well read, of course, so they know what we're talking about. But just in case, that's the period around which Moses leads the Israelites off around the Sinai, and so you can set it then if you want to, if you're desperate to fit into your fedora. So that's a little mean, though. I will say the majority of my I'd say a plurality of my listenership will share that faith, but a good majority of my listenership will also not. But at the same time, we recently came off of a several podcast back and forth series talking about religion in RPGs and how do you handle that. And there were a lot of people who were uncomfortable incorporating real world religions into RPGs, just partially out of respect, partially out of representation. And I think that's it's interesting what you're talking about now. The research you've done, the work you've put into it, and the way you're trying to present it from how you've described it to try to keep it respectful and create an RPG supplement that someone can use to their ends. If you want to run a Hittite campaign, you can. If you want to run a biblical narrative as an educational tool, you can. And
Mhm.
that's what really excited me the most about this particular Kickstarter. So that and the other two things that leading up to this point in the conversation that I said excited me most about this Kickstarter. So,
If you don't mind me asking a question, I'm just curious, what conclusion did you come to about faith in games? Because I think that is a really difficult thing to tackle, particularly when you are trying to be historical. You know, if I was trying to run a campaign with pretty much any other religion, I'd be very shy from it just because I do want to respect it and show it the historical and spiritual accuracy. So yeah, what did you guys find?
so what what I found for my personal campaign, what I do is I will take elements out of dead religions or archaic religions and
Mhm.
incorporate them as my own kind of spin. So I can't be too historically faithful because that requires more time and more research than I'm able to put into it anymore. And I don't want to be too close to reality because then I don't have as much license to wiggle. But
Mhm.
a buddy of mine, as a buddy of mine, Joey, put it, most people don't know anything about pre-Christian religions. So if you pick something from before the Christian epoch, then you pretty much have free license to do whatever you want. But that's
There's
it.
some truth to that,
Yep,
I guess.
yep, very much so. And so some other folks had mentioned they didn't want to incorporate the Christian God because to quote, he'd blow them out of the water. And this is come that one came from a more an evangelical type who's actually up your way, believe it or not. One of my
Oh,
buddies who podcasts out of Lord, I forget where, but they live in Michigan and they podcast out of Michigan, and the so from where he was coming from, if you put real God into an RPG, then it would throw off the balance. And
mm,
that was his Christian perspective, but
mm,
also that's in line with some of the original Appendix N material. Appendix N being part of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition, where the author suggested reading material. You should go read this if you want to get what this game is trying to accomplish. Namely, a line comes to mind out of Paul Anderson's The Broken Sword. Exquisite book. I really recommend it to anyone who's interested in reading. It doesn't feel like you're reading a book. It feels like you're sitting around a campfire hearing a skald chant the story to you as the snowflakes slowly melt on your nose. It's a very well written book, but in line with that, the juxtaposition of chaos and law is you have all of these pagan. It's not about behaving in a certain personality litmus. It's about the old ways being usurped by the new ones. And there's a seminal scene in that book. So spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read the book. There's a seminal scene in there where a witch is doing a deal with the devil to try to curse some of her adversaries, and in advising her that the to invoke the powers to do what she needs, he specifies the white Christ who comes and would wipe out that which came before. So that kind of progression of one way of life being overrun by one of the others, that's precedented in the literature. And so I've kind of deviated significantly from what your question was, but I tend to do that when I haven't slept very well.
Understandable.
But I think the end game there was that your mileage may vary. So
Mhm.
I will not put real live religions in my games, because I don't want to be disrespectful to them. And I also don't want to be bound to by reality. I like changing things, but also at the same time, there are a lot of folks out there who absolutely will. There's a couple big Kickstarters, Seven Voyagers, I believe, or Seven Voyages was one that we talked about, where this it was a setting, and it had all manner of different real world analogs. You had your Muslim analog culture, you had your Christian analog culture, you had your Hindu analog culture, and then they in your Arabic analog cultures, and that works for them. It worked for their campaigns. But again, your mileage may vary, and so the at the end of the day, inclusion of religions or religion in and of itself as part of a campaign world fits into the bag aesthetic. Why is that?
Mhm.
It's modular. You take the pieces that work for your table and you put those pieces in place, because at the end of the day, the game is about creating the experience together. And if you use the tools that your table is comfortable and skilled with, then you're going to make a much better experience along the way.
Well said. Yeah, well said.
Yep, yep. And that's the key. I keep rambling until I get something good, and then I stop myself. So that let's see, that goes through pretty much all of the question points that I had. That goes through a bunch of the stuff in the Kickstarter. I will, for all of you listeners or watchers, I will put the link to this Kickstarter in the show notes. And this runs until the 20th. I believe it's the 20th.
I think I think it's the 25th.
25th. Oh man, I have plenty of time. Yep, we have 15 days to go, according to this exact moment. So you have. I'm gonna do my best to get this episode out this Wednesday. I'm gonna say the date out loud so that I can get. I'm gonna try to get out Wednesday the 11th. And so as of the drop of this episode, you will have another 2 weeks to get in on this Kickstarter. And I really recommend you check it out. See if this is the kind of resource that you'd be interested in having, if if only for the history, and if only for the perspective and the opportunity to plug it into your game. And so we've gone through as much as I had planned. So I will leave the floor to you. If you have anything you'd like to speak up on, anything you'd like to leave the listener with this evening, the last word is yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, it's just been great talking with you. I guess if I could just leave a final word with anybody, it would just be, give us a chance. I'm a college guy. I'm kind of launching in a different direction for RPGs a little bit. I have a lot of respect for the games that are out there and the gamers and their experience, and really, I just want to create something awesome. And I think this Kickstarter is something pretty cool, and you can find out for, yeah, $5. And if that's really not your thing, but you're still interested, I encourage you to check out our website, hoodwinkgaming.com, and subscribe to our email list. We'll only talk to you when we have something to say. So yeah, we'll let you know on what other projects we're interested in, and we really do listen to feedback. So if you have any game ideas or anything you'd like to see, we'd love to work with you on it. Or I guess I should say I'd love to work with you on it. And yeah, so I hope we can add even just a little bit to your table and give you a good time.
Right, and well said, right back at you. And here at Clear Square Ring Rail, we try to support the little guy. Thank you, Josiah, very much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks. Pleasure was all mine.
The Clear Square Ring Mail podcast is an independently owned and operated product released for educational and informative purposes under the Totally Steal This license, which is kind of like Creative Commons, except licensing. Segments recorded within a vehicle are recorded using a Bluetooth hands-free device in conjunction with local vehicular safety legislation. Theme music for the Clear Square Ring Mail podcast is Gold Coffee by Michael Vermeer C, retrieved from Mixkit.co and used under the Mixkit royalty-free music license. Sound effects used in the Clear Square Ring Mail podcast are also retrieved from Mixkit.co and used in accordance with the Mixkit free sound effects license. Clear Square Ring Mail does not ascribe to nor endorse views or opinions expressed by call-ins, guests, or even the host, unless you think they're awesome, and thus does not assume any liability regarding the consumption or distribution of this podcast. By listening to the Clear Square Ring Mail podcast, you agree to these provided terms. Parties with questions regarding these terms, conditions, or releases are encouraged to reach out to Clear Square Ring Mail at the prescribed methods provided on the Clear Square Ring Mail blog. Parties dissatisfied with these terms, conditions, or releases are encouraged to go suck an egg.